The Illuminati, history's most infamous secret society, never actually disappeared. A dim, candlelit university chamber in Bavaria, 1785. Officials sort through confiscated papers stamped with odd symbols, while beyond the stone windows, whispers of revolution chase the Bavarian night. Officially disbanded, the Illuminati had already scattered intellectual seeds across Europe. The more striking truth is not that they survived, but what they were trying to do. They were not architects of secret governments. They were early designers of information warfare. The tactics they sketched became a blueprint for modern disinformation, an instruction manual for manufacturing fear itself. The candlelight scene we opened with feels cinematic, almost conspiratorial. And yet that dark university room is rarely the picture you learned in school. Now we step back into the version most people carry in their heads, the tidy, dramatic story that fits on a poster and in a weekend documentary. It is the comfortable myth, polished and ready for prime time. Think of the story you saw in films and late-night shows. A cabal of wealthy elites meeting in shadowed chambers, exchanging secret handshakes, deciding elections over crystal goblets. It is a neat storyline, villains with power, victims with names, a plot that explains chaos. In the popular telling, the Illuminati were founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt as a deliberate act of sedition. From that year onward, they allegedly infiltrated politics, finance, and culture to bring about a single global design, a new world order. It is an appealing narrative because it simplifies history. Revolutions, economic shocks, wars, everything becomes a move on a chessboard played by a handful of puppet masters. That is the version most often repeated, and its clarity is part of its power. Visuals do a lot of the work. The image of the all-seeing eye above a pyramid, the dollar bill under a magnifying glass, a celebrity flashed on screen with a superimposed triangle. These become shorthand. One quick cut and an audience understands someone is secretly in control. You learned this image through entertainment and internet sleuthing. It is compact, sensational, and shareable. Voices of the myth speak with certainty. A textbook-style narrator intones, "The Illuminati infiltrated Masonic lodges and governments to replace kings with their own hidden rule." A preacher from a historical reenactment declares, "They planned the overthrow of religion and throne." A documentary host in a voiceover assures, "Their symbols are everywhere, hidden messages, coded gestures, proof of continuity." Those statements, short and confident, fill the gaps the public prefers left empty. Why does the myth stick? Because for many people, the world feels too complicated, and a secret cabal is a tidy explanation. The chaos of markets, revolutions, and epidemics is hard to digest. An organized villain, one name, one network, gives coherence. This story answers two emotional needs. It provides a culprit to blame and offers a narrative where order underpins historical mess. In times of anxiety, that simplicity is seductive. Cultural amplification multiplied the myth. Beginning in the early 19th century and accelerating across 2 centuries, literature, essays, sermons, and later films reinforced a single image. Novels and pamphlets dramatized hidden councils. Clergy used the story to warn congregations. Politicians hurled the accusation at rivals. When Dan Brown's Angels and Demons opened at the turn of the 21st century, it did not invent the myth, it repackaged it for mass consumption. The novel's brisk sentences, rabid chase scenes, and symbolic set pieces turned centuries of rumor into a modern thriller. Media did more than repeat the story, it monetized it. Books with sensational claims sold well. Fringe networks found a steady audience in the anxious and the outraged. Click-driven platforms rewarded bold claims and visual puzzles.
Amateur sleuths, incentivized by likes and algorithmic boosts, turn speculation into spectacle. In this economy, uncertainty is profitable. The cost of doubt is attention. The reward is viral spread. The symbols, the eye, the pyramid, the triangle, play a crucial role. Symbols are cheap to reproduce and hard to disprove. One can point to an ordinary hand gesture and, with the right narration, transform it into evidence. In visual culture, repetition becomes meaning. A symbol displayed often enough in a pop video or ad accrues narrative weight. The logic is simple. If you see it enough times, your brain infers intentionality. The myth feeds on that cognitive shortcut. Beyond entertainment and profit, the myth is politically useful. In the heated politics of the 1790s, for example, labeling a rival as an Illuminati agent discredited them without evidence. He is in on the plot carries the force of an accusation that requires little proof to stick. Casting an opponent as part of a secret cabal substitutes psychological condemnation for legal proof. That rhetorical move is powerful. It silences debate by delegitimizing the target. The myth also migrates easily between contexts. In the chaos of revolutionary France, talk of secret societies functioned as a scapegoat for elites terrified of disorder. In 19th century America, as democratic politics stirred anxieties, the accusation appeared in partisan columns and sermons. During the Civil War, activists on both sides pointed fingers at shadowy manipulators to explain social change. Each crisis added layers, grafting older conspiracies onto new fears. As the 20th century unfolded, myth-makers found more tools. For some, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a vicious forgery, served as a template for embedding conspiracy narratives into ideological movements. Extremist groups fused the Illuminati myth with anti-Semitic lies, creating a particularly toxic hybrid.
In Cold War America, anti-communist crusaders repurposed Illuminati tropes to argue that liberalism and globalism were the work of hidden hands. The story adapted to fit the anxieties of each era. Hollywood turned the myth into spectacle. Films commodified the intrigue. Stylized rituals and cryptic symbols became aesthetics, and soundtrack swells turned suspicion into emotion. The entertainment industry is ambivalent. Sometimes it treats the Illuminati as parody. Other times it presents the myth as plausible mystery. Either way, the cinematic package feeds popular perception. When the Internet arrived, everything shifted. The barrier to publishing fell. Forums, blogs, and social media allowed anyone to connect dots in public. In those early networks, communities eagerly exchanged images and theories. An army of amateur investigators, working in threads and comment sections, performed what looks like research, but often leaned on confirmation bias. Patterns appeared. A celebrity's tweet, a logo in the background, an alleged ritual gesture. Each piece, shared and reshared, became evidence by repetition. Algorithms did the rest. Content that provoked anger or fear tended to prompt engagement. Platforms rewarded engagement, so false patterns got amplified. Emotional narratives outcompeted careful nuance. The myth thrived in an environment optimized for outrage. That is the modern story of the myth's growth. But what sustains it is not only external forces. It is human psychology. We prefer narratives that reduce uncertainty. We privilege stories that make moral sense. Conspiratorial frameworks give moral clarity. If there is a villain, victims are absolved from complex responsibility. That relief is psychologically appealing. Who benefits from the myth? The list is long. Publishers sell books. Documentaries gain viewers. Politicians weaponize the idea to smear challengers. Religious authorities use it to rally the faithful against modernist threats. Fringe personalities grow audiences and income. Even some mainstream brands exploit mythic imagery because controversy sells. There is a cottage industry of fear and suspicion.
But this polished version, grand, totalizing, and mechanically precise, has reasons to be suspect. It is shaped by storytellers who profit from certainty. It simplifies messy historical processes. It assigns agency where institutional and structural factors did the real shaping. It turns bargaining, accidents, and diffuse social forces into intentional plots. The version you learned comforts, but it also erases complexity. A few short voices from the official narrative illustrate how neat it sounds. They were the invisible hand behind revolutions, declares an authoritative-sounding historian in some dramatized segment. Their signs are everywhere, insists an internet host, voice low and confident. Follow the money, follow the symbols, advises a late-night commentator. Those lines are clean. They require little verification.
They invite you to accept a tidy answer. And yet, there are holes. That tidy story depends on assumptions that don't withstand scrutiny. That will be the next part of our investigation. For now, pause and consider. You heard a version of history that fits a narrative pattern. You saw images that promised meaning. You felt the comfort of a story that explained a complex world with a single cause. But good stories are not the same as good history. Thank you for staying with this investigation so far. If you're enjoying the deep dive, this channel is a small, growing project. Every new subscriber helps us keep digging and produce more investigations that schools seldom teach. If you can spare a moment to hit subscribe and share your city in the comments, you'll help this work reach the 1,000 souls who can keep the cameras rolling and the archives open. When you look past the shiny version of the story, the cracks appear fast. They are not subtle. They are factual, archival, and sometimes embarrassing to the neat narrative. The first fissure is obvious, the timeline. The second is membership and scale. The third involves symbols. The fourth is operational competence. Individually, these issues are inconvenient. Together, they make the classic story improbable. Start with the most basic fact. The original Bavarian Illuminati, as historians can reliably trace them, were active for less than 10 years. Founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt at the University of Ingolstadt and effectively suppressed in 1785, this was not a centuries-long enterprise. That compressed lifespan matters. A group dissolved in 1785 in a Europe that lacked modern finance, mass media, and rapid transport, could not easily orchestrate events that would unfold a century later. The often repeated claim that they controlled banking or elections in the 19th and 20th centuries stretches time into fantasy. So ask the obvious question: how did a small, short-lived society become a monster under the bed for modern politics? The answer starts with panic and poor information management on the part of governments and clergy. When Bavarian authorities seized documents and published accusations, they framed the Illuminati as a precisely organized conspiracy. That public panic, fed by fear, clerical rhetoric, and sensational leaks, projected more power onto the group than it ever wielded. Panic did what the group could not. It retrofitted scale and intent onto limited facts. Membership numbers further undercut the grand narrative. Contemporary estimates suggest the Bavarian Illuminati never numbered more than a few thousand at their height. Some historians place an upper bound around 2,000 to 3,000, and many local chapters were tiny. Compare that to the global networks the myth requires. To manipulate governments, finance, and culture across continents, you need networks of scale. Embedded agents, financial leverage, ideological unity maintained for decades. The historical record shows neither size nor cohesion sufficient for such ambitions. Many members were students and provincial intellectuals, not monarchs or banking magnates controlling state apparatus. Another contradiction lives in the symbols. The Eye of Providence and pyramids that conspiracy theorists point to as proof are older and more complex than the myth allows. The eye in a triangle, for instance, existed in religious iconography long before Weishaupt's circle.
It signified divine providence, not coded allegiance. The Great Seal of the United States, with its pyramid and eye designed in the early 1780s, is often misattributed to Illuminati influence. In reality, the symbol set has multiple origins in Enlightenment iconography, occult iconography, and classical revival aesthetics. Symbols travel and reappear. Similarity is not proof of continuity. Operational competence is a particularly telling strand. If the Illuminati were the masters of secrecy and infiltration their legend claims, they left no evidence of sustained covert operations beyond intellectual agitprop and mutual correspondence. The group's own documents, many of which were seized and published, reveal a society preoccupied with ritual rank, internal disputes, recruitment logistics, and basic bookkeeping. They were bureaucratic rather than Machiavellian. Far from a slick machine, the organization struggled with unpaid dues, jealous quarrels, and the mundane difficulties of maintaining any voluntary association. Worse for the myth, they were inept at maintaining secrecy. The Bavarian crackdown succeeded through ordinary police work, informants, examinations of correspondence, and public confessions. The story of a lightning-struck messenger, while dramatic, underscores how routine chance events and failures of discipline, not a targeted global betrayal, exposed them. Master manipulative organizations do not dissolve under such pedestrian exposures. Another layer of contradiction appears when you examine the geographical and technological context. The 1780s were an age of local print shops and slow postal routes. Ideas spread, yes, Enlightenment pamphlets crossed borders, but not at the speed or with the amplification modern conspiracies require. The myth that a network of scholars and freethinkers could shape mass opinion across continents presumes mass communication channels that did not yet exist. The organization was a node in an intellectual network, not the hub of a coordinated global disinformation system. We also confront the issue of motives. The original Illuminati's stated aims, religious tolerance, educational reform, resistance to superstition, are remarkably ordinary for an Enlightenment circle. Adam Weishaupt's complaints about clerical influence in Bavarian civil life were political and ideological, but not necessarily a blueprint for world conquest.
Their tactics, encouraging members to join other societies like Masonic lodges to recruit and influence, were mainstream strategies of the time. Infiltration in the sense of persuasion among elites is one thing. Orchestrating international events is another. Then there's the dossier problem. The documents that fueled the myth were often partial, edited, or framed by opponents. When Bavarian authorities published Illuminati papers, they did so with a purpose, to justify repression and delegitimize reform. Those documents became raw material for polemicists like Bahuel and Robison, who wove sensational claims from fragments. Their books, published in the 1790s, transformed bureaucratic memos and internal disputes into a global conspiracy narrative. The rhetorical project was clear. Explain the French Revolution and other upheavals as the work of a hidden cabal rather than as outcomes of economic crisis, political mismanagement, or social change. Another important contradiction is the selection bias in sources. Most of the dramatic evidence for an omnipotent Illuminati appears in the writings of their enemies. Those enemies had agendas. When ruling elites and conservative clerics set out to find a cause for revolutionary ferment, blaming a secret society served their interests. A convenient scapegoat arrived ready-made in the seized documents and in the febrile imaginations of attackers. The narrative that the group masterminded revolts is thus a case of attribution error magnified by political motives. Symbols and narratives migrated and were recontextualized in later centuries. White-hot claims that the Illuminati secretly control banks or Hollywood are modern projections. People in the 19th and early 20th centuries plugged the Illuminati into cultural anxieties about industrial capitalism, free thought, immigration, and social reform. Each decade rearranged the myth according to new fears. A claim useful to an 18th century prince became a radio-era smear. Later, it adapted to Cold War paranoia, and then to Internet-era viral speculation. Look also at the sociology of those who propagated the myth. Many early promoters, clerics, monarchist propagandists, reactionary intellectuals, had clear stakes. Their livelihoods and social orders depended on maintaining hierarchical authority and moral certainty. A secret society hypothesis allowed them to interpret social upheaval as cause, not consequence. That interpretive convenience explains why certain claims persisted despite weak evidence. Economics shaped the myth's durability. Publishing sensational claims sold. The brochure, the pamphlet, the serialized newspaper all could turn rumor into revenue. Where incentives align, where controversy equals sales, the public discussion skews toward flamboyant assertions. The Illuminati myth was a product in this marketplace. It paid. The modern information ecosystem amplified those incentives exponentially. The Internet rewards content that provokes.
Conspiracy narratives are optimized for sharing because they activate emotions, fear, indignation, curiosity. The original fragmentary evidence of a small Bavarian society thus found new life in platforms that reward virality over verification. Another contradiction worth noting is ideological heterogeneity. Members of the historical Illuminati were not a monolith. They included moderate reformers, ambitious intellectuals, and some radicals. Their views diverged. A coherent multi-century conspiracy requires ideological uniformity and disciplined secrecy. What the historical record shows instead is the messy reality of any voluntary political association, debate, factionalism, and turnover. Finally, consider the rhetorical power of absence. The lack of irrefutable evidence for a centuries-long global plot is not absence of proof only. It is active counter-evidence. A conspiracy of the scale claimed would leave traces, financial trails, repeated operational successes, institutional continuity. Historians who study archives, financial records, diplomatic correspondence find no such pattern. Instead, they find normal human organizational failures, lost letters, unpaid dues, unflattering minutes. These contradictions form a cascade. The more you inspect the timeline, the more the myth unravels. The smaller the group, the less plausible grand claims become. The more you examine sources, the more you see projection and propaganda. The visual coincidences of symbols melt when you trace iconography across contexts. The political convenience of blame emerges when you read the pamphlets that followed the document seizure. All this leads to a different and, for some, less satisfying conclusion. The Illuminati did not become an all-powerful cabal that engineered centuries of history. They were a small group whose ideas intersected with wider intellectual currents. Their greatest failure was not the lack of a plan, but the ethical inconsistency of seeking enlightenment ends by secretive means. Their greatest afterlife was not institutional power, but becoming a perfect story for those who preferred villains to complexity. That inversion, where the myth becomes bigger than the reality, is itself revealing. It shows how narratives operate. A group that left letters and meeting minutes and a handful of strategies for persuasion turned into a universal scapegoat because the politics of fear needed one. People did not fill the vacuum with truth. They filled it with stories that fit the emotional grammar of their times. This is not to deny that organized information manipulation existed historically. Elites and institutions have always tried to manage public opinion through pamphlets, sermon rotations, state-controlled gazettes, and commissioned art. What is important is the scale and intent.
The Illuminati's operational playbook, encouraging members to influence debates, placing sympathetic reviews, promoting certain pamphlets, was rudimentary and transparently ideological. Those techniques belong in the history of persuasion, not in the inventory of world domination. So where does that leave the myth? The myth is durable because it is useful. It is a rhetorical switch that reduces uncertainty. It is an emotional handrail. But once we identify the contradictions, timeline, scale, symbolism, source bias, opportunistic use by elites, the force of the myth diminishes. The harder work is to see how real influence functions, through institutions, economics, media systems, and social norms. Those mechanisms produce change without need of a single central mastermind. Hold that thought. The next part of this investigation reconstructs the human backstage, the awkward Weishaupt, the petty squabbles, the rituals borrowed from Freemasonry, and the very ordinary decisions that produced extraordinary consequences once others took hold of the narrative. But even now, the main point is clear. The most powerful illusion about the Illuminati is not that they were omnipotent, but that their myth has the power to make us accept simplified explanations for complex social realities. Behind the posterized image of cloaked conspirators and engraved symbols, the real story turns quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling because it is so ordinary. Adam Weishaupt does not arrive as a theatrical villain in a score of shadows. He appears as a single, complaint-riddled man in a small study, poring over books by candlelight while the winter wind chases soot across the panes. He is 28, a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt, and the angle from which historians most often approach him is not the angle of a demonic genius, but the angle of a frustrated academic who cannot get his lectures heard. Picture him at his desk, a narrow room, shelves bowed with texts, a half-burned candle leaving wax like a white scar. There is the smell of damp wool from his coat, the bitter fade of ink, the metallic tang of a lockbox where minutes and lists are kept. His handwriting, preserved in letters, is energetic but often cramped, thoughts spilling faster than they can be ordered. He writes about reason and tolerance with the same heat he writes about the petty failures of colleagues. The same pen that drafts a tract on civic life also scrawls a furious note about unpaid dues. That mix, idealism and small grievances, shapes the group's daily life. The Illuminati, in the eyes of contemporaries, is less a cell of masterminds than an association built out of the texture of academic life. Meetings after lectures, debates over breakfast, careful readings of Rousseau and Voltaire, and the familiar human drive to form alliances. The society's rituals, imported almost wholesale from Masonic practice, read less like occult design and more like social glue. Rank and ceremony created belonging. Ritual gave young men a sense of network and purpose. But ritual also masked insecurity. Initiations were long, ornate, and often comically earnest. Promises exchanged that, in practice, were hard to enforce. Daily operations fell to lists and ledgers. Membership rolls, minute books, and a surprisingly ordinary bureaucracy tell the tale. Recruitment strategies look like administrative memos. Who to approach at which lodge, which pamphlet to slip into a local reading circle, who might be sympathetic in the town council. It is the language of organization, not of apocalypse. That bureaucratic record is one reason the Bavarian crackdown worked. The group left paper traces in a way a truly paranoid underground would not. Financial life at the heart of the group was not funded by secret bank accounts or mysterious benefactors. Money came from member fees, small sums due quarterly, and from the occasional sympathetic noble. The picture that emerges from accounts is painfully human. Dues were late, receipts were lost. Weishaupt, who hoped for a disciplined machine, found himself chasing pocket change. There are repeated entries in his correspondence complaining about missed payments, petty theft, and the necessity of cajoling colleagues to contribute. The ideal of a tightly financed revolutionary engine collapses when you see the arithmetic. And then there is the social composition. The Illuminati's membership reads less like a cross-section of international elites and more like a network of provincial intellectuals. Grammar school teachers, minor officials, lawyers, students, a handful of mid-level clergy who secretly favored reform. Many members joined because it offered a forum for conversation and career advancement.
In that context, the Society's tactics, encouraging members to join Masonic lodges or book clubs, were simply strategies for influence available to anyone who wanted to build a network, work the room with a civic vocabulary. It looks a lot like early modern social climbing dressed in Enlightenment rhetoric. Weishaupt's internal contradictions are striking. In private, he advocates for broad civic liberty. In meetings, he demands secrecy and obedience. He dreamed of a rational society, but trusted hierarchical discipline to create it. In letters to close associates, he praises equality. In internal directives, he lays down strict chains of command. That tension, genuine aspiration bound to authoritarian method, explains both the group's initial attraction and its instability. You can see how the idea seduces, a world ordered by reason. You can also see how it fractures, reason administered from above, not debated widely. The practical form of the Illuminati's information strategy mirrored the unevenness of its membership. They were early practitioners of what would later be called entryism, joining existing clubs and lodges to shift conversations and recruit.
But their target was the circle of influence available to them: local newspapers, pamphlet printers, university salons. They wrote letters to publishers, placed book reviews, and tried to nudge opinion through the modest levers they could reach. It is easy to mock such techniques as ineffectual. It is harder, and more important, to notice how modern influence operations follow essentially the same logic, but at vastly greater scale. There are moments where the human fog clears, and operational failures show in stark relief. The group prized secrecy, but members were fallible. They argued loudly in public inns. They slipped names into correspondence without adequate ciphers. Some recruits were more interested in the trappings of ritual than in thought. Others betrayed confessions under pressure. The image of a polished machine controlling states dissolves when compared to the messy reality of unpaid dues, petty jealousies, and accidental leaks. Perhaps the most revealing scene is not in a dramatic council chamber, but in 8 pages of Weishaupt's private notes, where he berates a lieutenant for missing a meeting while complaining about his gout. The tone is petty, paternal, exhausted. The struggle to maintain cohesion is not the mark of a conspiracy that can run continents. It is the mark of a voluntary association trying, and often failing, to discipline human unpredictability. When Bavarian police begin their inquiries, it is not because of some grand intelligence operation. It is because of ordinary policing. Informants, suspicious landlords, intercepted letters. Officials pursue the paperwork trail with the routine cruelty of bureaucracy. Arrests follow. Careers are ruined. It is chaos, yes, but not the kind you expect from a teleological conspiracy. It is chaos made of small mistakes and bad luck. And yet this ordinariness contains a paradox. The very human texture of the Illuminati made it easier to project onto them an architecture they never possessed. The documents and memos, boring to the modern eye, were perfect raw material for sensationalists. They contained lists, names, and procedural language that, when read through the lens of panic, look like steps in a grand plan. That projective reading would be eagerly supplied by those who stood to benefit from a simple story. Blame the trouble on a secret cabal, and you avoid explaining more complex failures of policy, economy, and governance. There is a final intimate beat in this backstage portrait worth noting. When the pressure becomes real, when searches escalate and reputations crumble, Weishaupt does not call for a dramatic last stand. He flees. He seeks refuge, then a pension, then a quieter life writing tracts that never assemble into a coherent political program. The image of a man vanishing into clandestine triumph is false. The man vanishes into exile, into a provincial existence of letters and modest lectures. That mundane exit is telling. A failed organizer, not a triumphant architect. This humanized account does not absolve.
Secrecy, manipulation, and the willingness to deceive lower-ranking members are morally weighty. But it complicates the mythology. You learned to imagine a monument when the reality is a hastily built cottage. And that difference will matter, because the cottage's papers, its petty memos and recruitment lists, are about to be read as blueprints in public. What happens when ordinary notes are treated as evidence of world historical design? The answer is the next chapter, and it begins with a thunderstorm. The story sharpens into a single, almost cinematic instant. A messenger on a road in 1785, a storm that comes quicker than memory, and lightning that kills a man carrying a mail satchel. The image is as theatrical as any mythmaker could want, natural catastrophe colliding with human error, and it will change everything. Imagine the road, rutted, lined with hedges, the sky a bruised sheet. A courier, bundled against wind, rides toward a tavern where he intended to pass a packet of correspondence. He carries no chest of treasure, no coded device, just a satchel of letters. He may have been cold, hurrying, distracted. We do not know how he rode or why the storm honed in on that hour. What we do know is the effect. He collapses. Locals find the body and the satchel. They carry both into the nearest magistrate's office. What had been, until then, a set of private papers becomes contraband material in the hands of worried authorities. Bavarian officials open the satchel, and the shape of the material is mundane. Memos, initiation lists, instructions about recruitment, and, crucially, plans not of bombs or financial coups, but of influence. There are detailed notes on pamphlets to be placed, suggested book reviews, names of editors to approach, and strategies for undermining opponents by attacking their reputations. The documents read like a playbook for persuasion. They show intention, organization, and a method for shaping opinion across the literate public sphere. They do not, however, show an apparatus capable of instantaneously seizing treasuries or seeding wars across oceans. For the state, the papers are an emergency. Europe is already tremoring. The American experiment in Republican government has succeeded. The French mood is boiling. Ruling authorities read the documents through the most horrifying lens available, a targeted attempt to erode traditional structures of authority. The official response is severe and fast. Orders for searches cascade. Prominent members are detained. Printed materials are seized and burned. The state makes a show of power. Seizing the group's papers is theater as much as law. The consequences for individuals are brutal and disproportional to the group's actual capabilities. A university professor loses his chair. Clergymen who had flirted with reform are disgraced. Careers that took decades to build are wrecked in weeks. The legal machinery of repression, search warrants, proclamations, public denunciations, is precise. It is punishment not merely for what was done, but for what might be imagined from the papers now in custody. But repression has an unpredictable side effect. It magnifies what it seeks to suppress. When the state produces a public dossier on conspirators, it hands narrative fuel to those who want a simple explanation for complex upheaval. The seized documents are published in part and described in others, sometimes edited for dramatic effect. Suddenly, the Illuminati is not a local circle, but a monster in the public imagination. There is a moral and rhetorical sleight of hand here worth noting. The documents are damning enough to terrify an anxious state. They are not, however, a chain of command capable of orchestrating continental events. The difference between influence and omnipotence is vast, but, in the fog of panic, invisible. Officials and clerics who fear contagion, of ideas, of reform, of disorder, prefer the comforting diagnosis of a hidden hand. It delegates the explanation of social convulsion to a neat culprit. Blame becomes a tool of order. Publish the list of suspects, and you have diverted attention from economic dislocation, food shortages, political mismanagement. Enter the pamphleteers and polemicists, eager to fill a market for certainty. The story of the lightning-struck courier does not end in a criminal docket. It begins in presses across Europe. Writers who want to sell certainty find a golden thread in the Illuminati papers. Abbe Baruel and John Robison are the first to pluck that thread. Their books arrive with the nervous urgency of men convinced they have pierced a mystery. They are not historians in a modern sense. They are pamphleteers with an ideological stake, to explain the French Revolution and other eruptions as the work of clandestine masterminds rather than as failures of policy, structure, and human conflict. The rhetorical moves are simple and devastating. Baruel and Robison take fragments, internal memos, lists of names, suggestions for influence, and stitch them into a narrative of continuity and intent. They assume, without evidence, that infiltration of salons and lodges must lead inevitably to control of ministries and treasuries. They assert that symbols repeated across cultures mean monolithic unity of purpose. The leap is enormous and unsupported by archival proof, yet it fits what frightened elites want to hear. Those who wield power amplify the story. Monarchs and bishops find it convenient to present social unrest as the work of identifiable villains. The narrative offers moral clarity. The nation is threatened by perfidious outsiders. It is a language that simplifies governance. Rather than addressing structural grievances, you punish conspirators. You instruct clergy to preach against secret societies. You pass proclamations forbidding membership.
The state's panic becomes a program of cultural discipline. What follows is not merely suppression, but narrative manufacture. The seized papers are rewritten into sermons and pamphlets. Hearings are reported in alarming language. A minor suggestion in a memoir, Place Favorable Pamphlets, becomes the Illuminati controlled the press. The press, itself an arena of contest, repeats the story in ever-sharpening form. Rumors spread faster than corrections. The original documents, dry, procedural, and limited, are converted into a mythic script, a cabal with tentacles. The irony is bitter. The authorities who fear influence have, by exposing the papers and dramatizing them, multiplied the group's cultural power. Once turned into myth, the Illuminati grow, in part because so many vested interests need them to explain reality. For the embattled conservatives, the Illuminati become an all-purpose explanation for modernity's challenges: industrial unrest, liberal agitation, the declining moral authority of clerical structures. The myth supplies a scapegoat. It also supplies a sales market for books that traffic in certainty. And the myth will not remain in the pamphlets. It migrates into sermons and parliamentary debates. It becomes a rhetorical tool in partisan fights. In the United States, anxious federalists, eager to discredit opponents, latch on to the specter. Anti-Masonic movements expand the script. The image of secret rites, hidden symbols, and shadowy orchestration transfers easily across borders and eras. Where the original paper trail showed efforts to influence, the retold version alleges control. Through all of this, a simple fact persists and pains the careful reader. The Illuminati, as an organization, was less an engine of covert global governance and more an experimental model of organized persuasion. The documents in the Courier satchel reveal techniques worth noting: targeted pamphleteering, coordinated reviews, conversations in salons. Those techniques were powerful in context, but they were instruments of persuasion, not instruments of world domination. Yet the public will seldom hear that nuance. When fear is the currency, nuance is a poor seller. The dramatic moment, the courier's death, becomes the hinge on which centuries of suspicion swing. A stack of mundane papers will, in the hands of frightened authorities and inventive propagandists, become the evidence for a global design. And in a world already trembling with change, the idea of an organized enemy is comforting. There is another consequence that will grow slowly, almost imperceptibly: the transformation of the techniques themselves. The strategies the group outlined — identify gatekeepers, seed favorable reviews, create networks of sympathetic voices — are not inherently nefarious. They are simply methods for shaping public opinion. But once published, those methods do not vanish. They circulate.
They are copied, refined, and sometimes weaponized by others far more capable and far better funded than the original society ever was. The lightning that killed the messenger extinguished one life. It also lit a fuse under a different kind of engine, the engine of rumor, panic, and strategic narrative. The papers become, paradoxically, both the justification for repression and the blueprint for modern information work. What begins as an administrative record is about to be retooled as a manual by enemies and friends alike. The implications of that transformation will echo through the 19th century and into our own. But before we get there, the story needs printers, polemicists, and a public eager for simple answers. The machine of propaganda, once set in motion, requires very little to run. The myth does not arise by accident. It is manufactured in a sequence that looks almost inevitable once the levers are known. The machine that takes a disbanded intellectual society and converts it into an enduring global conspiracy is not a mystical device. It is a chain of human choices: books selected for market appeal, editors who prefer clarity to complexity, preachers who need a villain, and statesmen who need scapegoats. The process has stages, and each stage supplies an amplification function. Stage 1 is the polemicist. Abbé Augustin Baruel and John Robeson are prototypes of a certain type of writer. Learned enough to be plausible, anxious enough to be urgent, and rhetorically gifted enough to make connections that fact-checking cannot immediately sever. They read the seized documents and see patterns, not only those present on the page, but patterns they fear. Baruel writes from the vantage of a cleric desperate to explain the collapse of traditional authority. Robeson writes from a scientific mind convinced he sees systems at work. Both publish quickly. Speed is essential. In politics, the first narrative offered often becomes the dominant one. Stage 2 is the amplifier. Institutions with electoral, doctrinal, or monetary incentives to promote a simple story. Monarchs and churches, threatened by reform, have political reasons to endorse the narrative that upheavals are the work of conspirators, not consequences of fiscal strain or popular mobilization. The press, ever hungry for saleable certainty, echoes the theme. Sermons interpret the documents as evidence of moral decay. In this environment, nuance dies not from lack of validity, but from lack of market logic. Stage 3 is the rhetorical architecture, symbols and metaphors. The eye of providence on a seal, the pyramid on a coin, a triangle hand gesture in an illustration. These become nodes in a semiotic web. Similarity takes the place of proof. A symbol used for divine oversight becomes proof of continuity between disparate actors separated by geography and ideology. The logic is visual and veracious. Once you accept that symbols are secret signatures, every recurrence becomes a data point. Visual culture, which moves fast and sticks, becomes a caricaturist of history. Stage 4 is the cross-pollination with other mythic forms. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an outright forgery, offers a template for grand conspiratorial narratives. Once that template exists, it can be grafted onto other anxieties, producing a toxic hybrid. Anti-Semitic forgery, anti-Masonic sentiment, and the Illuminati myth fuse in various contexts, amplifying reach and danger. The myth migrates between languages, religions, and political systems because it offers a reusable chassis. Identify the enemy, project your fears outward, and rally the faithful. Stage 5 is commodification by culture. Hollywood, pulp fiction, and later television turned the myth into spectacle.
A conspiracy that once needed a print run becomes plot scaffolding for thrillers. Symbols become costume. Controversy sells. In the 20th century, thrillers and melodramas recast shadowy councils and cryptic rituals as entertainment. Paradoxically, the popularity of the theme increases credulity. People who never read Barruel or Robeson have now been socialized by cinema and pop music into recognizing the visual grammar of conspiracy. Stage 6 is technological acceleration. When print was the medium, a rumor required presses and time. Radio shortened that time. Television made the image immediate. The Internet collapses authority and multiplies voices. Small communities, forums, mailing lists, later social networks become echo chambers where prurient analysis substitutes for archival research. Algorithmic platforms prioritize engagement. Engagement thrives on conflict and fear. Thus, the myth's velocity becomes exponential. A fringe claim can be visually packaged, emotionally charged, and algorithmically amplified in hours. Throughout these stages, the original methods the Illuminati had documented in their satchel, target influential reviewers, seed pamphlets, build a network, are repurposed. What was an early experiment in persuasion becomes a modular playbook. Political actors, advertisers, and activists refine the techniques with resources the original group lacked. We see focus groups replacing salons, data analytics replacing lists of sympathetic Freemasons, and media consultants replacing itinerant pamphleteers. The mechanics are the same, the scale is different. That evolution explains a grim irony. The Illuminati's modest influence tactics, exposed and condemned, seeded a set of practices that others would perfect into mass influence operations. Governments learned to manage public opinion through state papers and controlled media. Commercial firms hired modern propagandists called marketers. Political operatives refined targeting. We see focus groups replacing salons, data analytics replacing lists of sympathetic Freemasons, and media consultants replacing itinerant pamphleteers. The mechanics are the same, the scale is different. That evolution explains a grim irony. The Illuminati's modest influence tactics, exposed and condemned, seeded a set of practices that others would perfect into mass influence operations. Governments learned to manage public opinion through state papers and controlled media. Commercial firms hired modern propagandists called marketers. Political operatives refined targeting.
Meanwhile, conspiracy communities learned to mimic the tactics of legitimate campaigns, memes instead of pamphlets, coordinated hashtags instead of letters to editors, narrative control instead of academic debate. The original model of identify gatekeepers and seed ideas becomes universal. But there is another, less technical element to this machine: human psychology. The myth thrives because of cognitive patterns that predate print: pattern-seeking, agency attribution, and moral simplification. We prefer villains because villains allow us to avoid ambiguity. Villains permit moral clarity. The propaganda machine exploits these biases. It offers a single identifiable cause rather than a tangled system of causes. For anxious publics, that is a relief. For those who benefit from the narrative, politicians, preachers, publishers, relief becomes profit. The machine also depends on omission. The most successful narratives do not merely assert, they silence. Documents are edited, inconvenient facts omitted, context removed. The process looks like curation to a casual reader: short, sharp claims that feel authoritative because they are repeated. Repetition is a technique as old as time, and the modern machine is simply more efficient at it. A claim repeated on radio, in print, in sermon, and on stage acquires the patina of truth by sheer saturation. We must also note the role of identity politics in the myth's survival. When a narrative attaches itself to a political identity, those who oppose us are secret conspirators, it becomes impervious to contradiction. Evidence is reinterpreted, silence becomes proof, and skepticism is reclassified as treason.
This dynamic helps explain why conspiracy theories persist despite disconfirming evidence. They become part of a social identity, not merely a set of beliefs. Finally, the propaganda machine is not only external, it is reflexive. Once a myth exists, actors adjust to it and exploit it. Publishers print sensationalist volumes because they know there is demand. Politicians make accusations because they can use the myth to delegitimize opponents. Cultural producers traffic in symbolism because controversy sells. Each iteration makes the machine more robust. What was once a provincial affair becomes a global industry. None of this means the original papers were harmless. They contained techniques that could be and were manipulated. But the moral horsepower that turned them into a monster did not come from Weishaupt's circle. It came from fear, opportunism, market dynamics, and the architecture of modern media. The result is a modern ecology in which the line between influence, persuasion, and manipulation becomes dangerously thin. By the mid-19th century, the Illuminati are less an organization than a trope. They become a rhetorical switch, the phrase that explains away complexity. That switch survives into today, adapted by new actors and mounted on new media.
The most painful irony is this. The techniques that began as the clumsy work of a provincial group are now perfected until they threaten the possibility of a shared factual world. The propaganda machine, composed of writers, states, clerics, markets, and platforms, has not only made the myth durable, it has normalized the techniques. The rhetorical habits, promotional systems, and emotional levers are now part of everyday life. The question before us is not simply who controlled whom in the 18th century, but how the strategies first documented then have been incorporated into how we form beliefs now. The answer will require us to look not for a secret lodge in a cellar, but at the very systems that shape what we accept as truth. And so the machine turns. What began as a bundle of handwritten notes and a tragic courier's death became a manual, a template, and finally a culture. The myth that started small has outlived its makers and now lives in institutions, narratives, and technologies. The next move is to ask, what is the honest portrait that remains once the propagandists have had their say? Who was Weishaupt really, and what of his design, if anything, still shapes our world? The answer is not simple, and the search for it takes us into uncomfortable territory. What remains when you strip away the myth, the pamphlets, the sermons, and the Hollywood motifs is a stranger picture than either the caricature or the hagiography. The honest portrait of Adam Weishaupt and his circle is not simple. It is a study in contradictions, Enlightenment zeal mixed with clandestine procedures, pedagogical optimism laced with organizational paranoia. It is a human drama staged inside the brittle institutions of late 18th century Bavaria. Imagine Weishaupt in a small study in Ingolstadt. The room smells of candle wax and ink. A narrow window throws a thin rectangle of gray light across his desk. He has the posture of a man who believes language can remake habit. His handwriting is neat but impatient. That image matters because it contradicts the cinematic villain. He is a professor first, a conspirator second, and his tools are syllabi and letters as much as oaths. There are 4 axes on which the honest reconstruction must be built: character, objectives, methods, and impact. Each axis collapses one of the comfort stories you were told in school and replaces it with the messy logic of real ambition. Character. The myth sells a demonic genius who masterminded catastrophes. The archive gives us an anxious intellectual, ambitious to the point of insecurity. Weishaupt wanted influence because he lacked it by birth. He was a teacher who resented the academy's dependence on clerical patronage. He could be generous, mentoring students, drafting curricula, and petty, insisting on ritual rank and secret reverence. He loved debate, but he craved obedience. That mix produced a man both convincing and flawed. Objectives.
The standard legend compresses complex aims into one headline: world domination. The evidence resists that compression. Weishaupt's program reads as education reform dressed in a quasi-ritual language. He wanted to cultivate a network of reasoned citizens, people who would value evidence over dogma, and who would displace priestly power by the slow work of schooling and print. That is both less glamorous and more dangerous to those invested in the old order. The goal was influence over ideas, not bank vaults or armies. It's important to say that plainly. The group's ambitions were political in the sense of wanting social change, not imperial in the sense of conquest. Methods. Here is the uncomfortable part. Methods matter because they reveal character. Weishaupt borrowed tricks from Freemasonry: initiation, graded learning, discrete circles. He combined them with bureaucratic discipline, membership lists, correspondence networks, recommended reading. He encouraged members to join lodges and societies already accepted in public life. That tactic, entry, not open confrontation, is classic network strategy, and it looks eerily modern. But it was also, at times, ethically compromised. There is evidence he concealed goals from junior members and pressed for loyalty in ways that required deception. Those choices are neither heroic nor cartoonishly evil. They are practical and morally ambiguous. Impact. On paper, the organization did not overthrow states. In practice, its techniques rippled out in ways its founders did not foresee. The most uncomfortable truth is this: ideas about how to shape public conversation were tried in a small German setting, then observed, adapted, and amplified elsewhere. The practical lesson was simple: target the people who decide what others read and hear, and you change what people think about. That lesson traveled far beyond Bavaria. Now step back and view the social network. Weishaupt's circle was not a top-down hierarchy of princes and bankers. It was an assemblage of professors, minor officials, clerks, and aspiring students. Picture a map: nodes in university towns, threads running to lodges, dots where printing presses clustered, marginal notes tagging sympathetic authors. The power here is diffuse. Influence was intended to be stealthy and cumulative. It was the long game. That makes the group dangerous to conservative clerics and comfortable to quasi-moderns who see networked influence everywhere. It is also essential to acknowledge the limits of what we can know. Sources are uneven. Many letters survive, many do not. Some reports come from hostile magistrates eager to make a scandal. Historians agree on the broad shape. Weishaupt's aims were reformist, his methods secretive, but they disagree on degree. Where consensus fades, hypothesis begins. We should say that transparently. What is consensus? What is probable? What remains disputed?
Consensus. The group existed. Its membership was modest. It used networks to spread ideas. It was suppressed in the 1780s. Probable. Weishaupt intended broader cultural change. Some members engaged in real deception of outsiders. Their tactical manuals inspired imitators and opponents. Disputed. Claims that the group orchestrated revolutions, controlled finance, or survived as an intact international cabal. Understanding those zones matters because it reframes moral calculus. If you believe the incendiary claims about global control, you treat the subject as simple treason. If you accept the modest but consequential account, you face a nuanced problem. What does it mean when citizens weaponize persuasion in the service of ideals? Let us animate a few vignettes that show how these tensions played out in practice. Scene 1. A library meeting in late 1779. A modest firelight, a dozen men clustered around a table. They pass a pamphlet back and forth. One reads aloud a paragraph criticizing clerical control of education. No slogans, no saber-rattling, just argumentation dressed in irony. That's persuasive work. Slow, patient, tedious. It's the kind of work that builds institutions over a generation. Scene 2. A lodge in Munich. The same rhetoric now has ceremonial framing. A newcomer is subtly asked to sign to prove loyalty. This is where the moral line blurs. Is asking a new recruit to swear loyalty a protective measure against infiltration, or an initiation into a culture of secrecy that inclines to deception? The archive does not give a neat answer.
Weishaupt himself, by his letters, oscillates between defensive paranoia and pedagogical openness. Scene 3, the courier on the road, the lightning and the satchel. You know this image. It is the hinge between the technical methods and political consequence. What falls out isn't a plan for immediate insurrection. It is the record of a functioning information operation. Names, lists, suggested reviewers, recommended pamphlets. That level of bureaucratic detail is both mundane and revealing. It shows an apparatus thinking through the practicalities of persuasion, who to recruit, what to publish, how to talk about enemies. Those are operational documents. They are not master plans for world government, but they are a manual of sorts for shaping the textual environment. And the manual is what made the group radioactive. The authorities saw in the notes a pattern that their imaginations amplified. A government frightened by a culture of dissent read administrative details as evidence of total war against the state. That fear was not irrational in its time. Rulers had seen revolt. But the leap from influence to omnipotence was rhetorical, not evidentiary. Here is the hard ethical point. The methods the group developed are morally ambivalent. To teach, to persuade, and to cultivate circles of trust is part of civic life.
To do so in secret, to require deceptive promises, and to coordinate targeted influence campaigns crosses into manipulative territory. The Illuminati's legacy is not its intentions alone, but the moral choices embedded in its tactics. There is also a psychological ingredient worth naming. The culture of secrecy produces its own incentives. Once you normalize hidden avenues to power, you invite escalation. Small lies become regular tactics. Ambition seeks efficiency. The institutionalized secrecy that protected members becomes the very mechanism that divorces means from ethical reflection. You can see the arc. An experiment in Enlightenment pedagogy slides, in human time, toward organizational habits that would justify more intrusive interventions in public discourse. This is not to lay a moral indictment at the feet of every member. Many were sincere reformers. Many joined for networking. Some were careerists thinking of patronage. The portrait we get is of a mixed company whose shared ideal, wider access to reason, acquired in practice morally contested apparatus. The honest view also insists on historical proportionality. If Weishaupt's circle taught techniques later used for darker ends, that is a lineage, not a command from beyond the grave. Responsibility is distributed. A technique is a technique. It can be used by liberals, reactionaries, corporations, or conspiracists. The origin story matters because it shows the method's provenance, but origins do not determine destiny. There are lessons here for how we judge past actors. One temptation is to moralize retrospectively. If a method can be abused, we call the inventor a villain. That is too neat. A more careful judgment acknowledges three things: the innovator's stated aims, the ethical compromises he accepted, and the unpredictable ways techniques travel. Weishaupt must be held to account for secretive practices he endorsed. He cannot be blamed for everything those methods enabled thereafter. Finally, the honest portrait demands we examine the context that made secrecy attractive. Bavaria in the 1780s was not a liberal paradise. The church had institutional power over schooling. Dissent carried career risk. The Spanish Inquisition is not the right comparison, but the point is the same. When open debate is dangerous, clandestine channels seem like the only option for reformers. That doesn't justify deception. It does, however, explain why a professor might prefer strategy over sermon. You learned, and perhaps still learn, a tidy story. Secret society, global threat. When you think of the real Weishaupt now, try instead this image. A man who preferred written programs to coups, who believed in networks because they could outlast rulers, and who could not foresee how his small tactical playbook would be seized, exaggerated, and turned into something monstrous by frightened elites and entrepreneurial pamphleteers. And here comes the sting. The problem never required a satanic mastermind. It required ordinary incentives, fear, ambition, rhetorical profit, and a set of techniques that could be copied. That is the most honest and most unsettling conclusion. The Illuminati matter not because they controlled the world, but because they taught how to try. This reconstruction opens another door. If the group's main contribution was methodological, then our job as citizens is to scrutinize methods. Who trains our gatekeepers? How are reputations manufactured? What ethical standards govern those who shape public discourse? Those are the questions that matter going forward, and they are questions that the myth of a single omnipotent cabal has successfully obscured for centuries. The work now is to look at the apparatus, not the phantom, and to ask whether the apparatus serves democracy or corrodes it. Mini cliffhanger. The portrait shifts the scene from Bavaria to the newsroom, to the marketing firm, to the campaign office, because the techniques live on. You cannot dismiss the past as quaint. The methods are now everywhere, and recognizing that will change how you see the present. If the honest portrait showed how methods originated in a provincial university, the next questions are sharper. Where did those methods travel? How were they adapted? And how do they shape the world you live in now? The answer is everywhere you look: politics, advertising, entertainment. And in each sector, the same basic mechanics have been refined, industrialized, and weaponized. Start with politics. The playbook the Illuminati sketched, identify gatekeepers, seed sympathetic reviews, coordinate voices, reads like the skeleton of a modern campaign. Campaign strategists today call the elements different names: message discipline, rapid response, targeted outreach. But the logic is continuous. You do not need a secret society to manipulate opinion. You need a system that knows where conversations begin and how they propagate. Visualize a campaign war room. Screens glow with polling data, social feeds, and lists of sympathetic bloggers. There are teams drafting friendly op-eds, scheduling friendly television bookings, and drafting talking points for surrogates. The operation is less mystical than methodical, mapping influence, testing messages, amplifying what works. That is the same basic idea Weishaupt urged, only now with market research, polling analytics, and micro-targeting. The scale and precision changed, but the principle is familiar. In the corporate sphere, the same template is routine. Marketing is modern persuasion with a more benign name. Brand strategists build narratives that align products to identity. Thought leadership becomes a vehicle to influence regulatory debates or public perception. Companies fund think tanks, seed academics, sponsor conferences. The tactic works because audiences trust perceived expertise. The tactic mirrors the Illuminati manual because both operate by inserting sympathetic voices into existing authoritative spheres. Now, the more disquieting adaptation. Conspiracy communities and ideological movements turned the methods back on themselves. QAnon and comparable networks create closed epistemic spaces, feeds, forums, live streams, where members are taught how to read the world through a particular lens. These groups recruit, test theories, craft memes, and coordinate messaging to maximize emotional spread. The techniques: seed a claim in a marginal venue, amplify through social media, exploit algorithmic feedback, are direct descendants of the playbook. The difference is scale and velocity. Social media deserves a separate passage. Algorithmic platforms reward engagement, not truth. The UV light of virality picks out the most emotionally charged content. That is the ecological condition that transforms a small manipulative tactic into mass persuasion. Weishaupt's documents recommended placing pamphlets. Today's actors place viral videos and coordinated hashtags. The platform mechanics accelerate the spread so dramatically that small conspiracies can metastasize in days. The entertainment industry plays two roles. On one hand, it commodifies the myth. Films, television, and music gamify the imagery, secret rituals, enigmatic symbols, clandestine cabals, and in doing so, normalizes the visual grammar of conspiracy.
On the other hand, entertainment often functions as social rehearsal. When audiences consume narratives of secret power, they practice suspicion. Pop culture thus both profits from and feeds the appetite for conspiracy. There is an ironic feedback loop here. The early scare about the Illuminati, amplified by fearmongers in the 1790s, created demand for books and pamphlets that proved, to anxious readers, the group's moral ruin. Those books expanded the myth, which in turn created more demand. Today, the Internet compresses that loop into an instant. Suspicious claim, viral pickup, monetized content, further suspicion. To grasp the consequences in concrete terms, consider three planes of legacy: political-social, religious-ideological, and cultural-commercial. Political-social. The legacy here is institutional. Because narratives can be constructed and weaponized, political actors increasingly prioritize control of narrative infrastructures. They invest in media, deploy sympathetic commentators, and cultivate think tanks. Policy debates become battles over which narrative dominates, rather than discussions about evidence. This shifts incentives. Winning becomes about controlling perception rather than solving problems. When institutions favor spin over substance, public trust erodes. The result is fragmentation, different publics, different facts, different realities. Religious ideological. Where the Enlightenment promised debate would weaken superstition, the long arc has been more ambivalent.
Religious institutions once targeted as enemies of reform learned to use the language of conspiracy defensively. Sermons and doctrinal statements equate dissent with sedition. In some cases, religious rhetoric has fused with conspiratorial templates, blaming social change on hidden enemies. The fusion is potent because it marries existential belief to identity politics, making skeptics into heretics. The cost is a harder line between belief and political allegiance. Cultural-commercial. Cultural industries monetize myth. Tour operators sell Illuminati tours. Fashion houses incorporate occult tropes. Music videos lace imagery with triangles and eyes because controversy sells. The commodification transforms danger into spectacle. Spectacle destigmatizes the symbol while widening its reach. That means that the same images used to stir fear now sell sneakers. When spectacle erases seriousness, the public's ability to distinguish satire, metaphor, and evidence atrophies. This is not simply a catalog of abuses. There are efficiencies. Public health campaigns borrow precision messaging to save lives. Advocacy groups coordinate to protect rights. Small movements use the same tools to win attention for causes that mainstream media have ignored. The techniques are morally neutral in the abstract. The problem is incentive structure. What rewards short-term engagement, outrage, and clear villains over sober deliberation? One concrete mechanism explains much of the present pathology: identity entanglement. When a narrative becomes part of a social identity, it becomes immune to contradiction. Evidence against a cherished story is not information, it is betrayal. That dynamic fuels the survival of conspiratorial narratives even in the face of disconfirming facts. The original Illuminati papers were dry and tactical. The myth turned them into identity markers. Today, identity trumps evidence in many online tribes. Another mechanism is omission. The most effective stories do not merely assert, they silence. Edits, selective quoting, and curated archives produce a streamlined narrative. That process was visible in the 19th century, when clerics and officials edited seized documents into sensational pamphlets. It is visible now when clips are taken out of context, when algorithms amplify fragments and hide nuance. The net effect is the same, a narrowed field of view shaped by those with resources to curate attention. There is also a jurisprudential dimension. Democracies depend on a baseline of shared facts. Once that baseline phrase, governance becomes transactional and symbolic rather than rational and procedural. Policy becomes about who can mobilize the loudest narrative coalitions, not about long-term problem solving. That is a structural pathology. But before this becomes too bleak, notice a hopeful pattern. Awareness can be contagious too.
The same social platforms that accelerate falsehoods can also be used to educate, to trace manipulative tactics, and to surface contradictions quickly. Journalistic networks now collaborate internationally to trace disinformation campaigns. Civil society organizations teach media literacy. These are the modern equivalents of the interventions that, in other eras, helped guard against propaganda excesses. So where does that leave the ordinary person? First, with a practical observation. The techniques of influence are now part of everyday life. You encounter them when you read a tweet, watch a sponsored post, or see a headline about a scandal. Recognizing the mechanical patterns, who benefits from the claim, which voices are being amplified, what emotional hooks are used, is the first defense. Second, institutional reform matters. Stronger disclosure rules, transparency about who funds content, and regulations that mitigate algorithmic incentives could change the ecosystem. Third, individual habits matter. Diversified information diets, curiosity about sourcing, and a tolerance for complexity make you more resilient to simplistic narratives. And there is one final, sharper irony. The myth of the Illuminati succeeds because it offers epiphanies. It tells people there is a simple explanation for complexity. That promise is as seductive now as it was 2 centuries ago. But the cost of embracing that simplicity is to hand over interpretive autonomy to others. The remedy is not indifference, nor is it paranoia. It is an active practice of verification, of caring about provenance, and of asking who profits from the story you were given. Many cliffhanger. You are now seeing how the tactics invented in a small Bavarian circle have metastasized into systems that shape elections, markets, and personal identities. The final question becomes existential. Do we regulate the machines, rewire incentives, or retrain citizens? The answer will not be quick. The next segment will turn this unease into a single unsettling question that reframes the whole story. We began with a lightning strike and a satchel of papers. We end with a different strike, one that hits our shared sense of reality. The path was clear. A modest experiment in persuasive organization, a state's fearful amplification, a centuries-long machinery of myth-making, and finally, modern systems that have absorbed the techniques into everyday life. The trajectory is unsettling because it reveals a quiet truth. The power that most changes what people believe is rarely a secret cabal. It is an apparatus, networks, markets, platforms, priests of every stripe, that teaches us how to think.
So here is the question the episode leaves on the table, and it is an uncomfortable one. If the methods that manufacture consent and suspicion are now ordinary, do we still need a single enemy to explain our world? Or have we built an information ecosystem so normalized and distributed that the real problem is not who pulls the strings, but that the strings exist at all? Thanks for staying with this investigation. If you found this unpacking useful, subscribe and help us reach more viewers who want to look past tidy stories. Leave a comment. Where did you first hear the Illuminati story in your country? Tell us your city. Let's map who is still asking the hard questions. This is one file in a larger dossier. There are more myths waiting to be opened.